Hi, I'm James Miller, the online ministry specialist at Pine Island United Methodist Church in Pine Island, Minnesota. We're so glad you found this video. If you'd like to see them all, make sure you click subscribe so you don't miss a single one.
Welcome. It's great to have you with us. We are so glad that you found this video. I'm Tony Fink. I'm the pastor appointed to serve the Pine Island, Minnesota area for the United Methodist Church.
And I'm James Miller. I'm the online ministry specialist at Pine Island United Methodist Church.
This week, we are looking again at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Today, we're going to be looking at keeping the instructions given to us from the law and the prophets. And you mean all like 613 laws and statutes and ordinances? What was Jesus thinking? And then Jesus tells us that our righteousness needs to be greater than the legal experts, the scribes, and the Pharisees of his day. I wonder how we can be able to do this. You have to check around and find out, huh? This is something called our Worship Highlights video. It's a shorter version of our worship experience here in Pine Island. If you'd like the complete worship service, it's available on our website. That's piumc.org.
And we're glad you're here. We're very glad you've connected with us. If you'd like to say hi to us, just click Contact Us at the top of that webpage. Or you can even just go to the Facebook and click Like, the little button that lets us know that you're with us. Speaking of Facebook, that's where we host our digital campus. There's a link to it on that website, piumc.org. And you'll also find a standing invitation to our Wednesday night digital coffee house at 6 o'clock Central Time.
Yeah, and if you're ever in Pine Island, Minnesota, you can find our address, even directions to where the church is on our website. On Sunday mornings, we have inside worship at 9 o'clock. We go out to the parking lot at 10:30. And then between our two services, we have Sunday school for children and youth and coffee fellowship at 10 o'clock for everyone who's here in person.
And if you ever join us in time for the live stream, or maybe even just catch the end of the hour, you can join us for digital coffee fellowship on Sunday mornings, 10 a.m. to 10:30 Central Time. So with all that said, we thank you once again for joining us for this shorter version of our worship experience.
And friends, it's our hope, it's our prayer that you will be blessed by this week's video.
You know, Rick brings up a good point. If you remember from last week, this is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, right? We're just getting started. And there were crowds from like all over the region, and not even just the region of Judah and Israel, but even across the Jordan. Huge crowds. But at this point in the story, Jesus goes up a mountain with his disciples and sits down and teaches to these newest disciples. So he's talking to the small group, not to the thousands. So thanks for bringing that up, because that's an important thing to remember with the sermon today. You know, some weeks it feels as though the world is broken, hurting and broken, in need of healing and hope. And not just our political world, but also our culture and our society and our communities, and even in some cases, persons. Maybe even ourselves or our family members. You know what? This is not the first time that the people of the Lord God have felt this way. Last week we heard from the prophet Micah. This week we hear from the prophet Isaiah. This is one of the readings that's assigned for this week. Isaiah says, "Shout loudly, don't hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their crime, to the house of Jacob their sins." Did you hear that? I said, raise your voice like a trumpet. What did Savannah do? Okay? Yeah, raise your voice that loud. Isaiah continues. This is God speaking now. "They seek me day after day, desiring knowledge of my ways, like a nation that acted righteously, that didn't abandon their God. They ask me for righteous judgments, wanting to be close to God." Isaiah continues, but back in Isaiah's day, things were not good. Society had abandoned and forgotten God. I don't know, maybe in today, things seem with us that things are not so good. Like our culture has abandoned and forgotten God. Well, guess what? In Jesus' day, it was the same case. Okay? So in the midst of this, in the midst of what's going on in the world and everything else, Jesus tells his disciples, okay, that small group, and he also tells us, in the midst of all this stuff that's going wrong, you are the light of the world. A city on top of a hill can't be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a basket. No, instead they put it on top of a lampstand, and it shines on all those who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people, so they can see the good things that you do and praise your Father who's in heaven. So, friends, even in the darkness, we are called to shine. We are called to be an example of how to live reflecting the glory of God. And then our passage today ends with Jesus telling those who are just about to follow him, those who've just started, I say to you that unless your righteousness is greater than the righteousness of the legal experts and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus is saying that we have to be even better than the legal experts, the scribes, those men whose job it was to make handwritten copies of the scriptures day after day. You know, you copy the Bible by hand year after year, you pretty much got it memorized, right? Yeah. So those are the scribes, the legal experts. And Jesus tells us to be even better than the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were a Jewish religious movement that began about 150 years before Jesus was born. Okay? The term Pharisees means to be set apart. Okay? So they lived their lives apart from others, and they focused on keeping all of the commandments of God. Some of the commandments, all of the commandments of God. And they did this so that God would be pleased and return to save his people, the Israelites. So the scribes, the legal experts, they knew the law. The Pharisees, they kept the law. And Jesus is telling his new disciples, people who are making the decision to follow and learn from him, maybe perhaps like you and I, like us, if we are seeking to follow and learn from Jesus, he's telling them, he's telling us, that we have to be better than, we have to be more righteous than the legal experts and the Pharisees. Does that mean keeping all the commandments? Yes. Being even better than the scribes and the Pharisees? Yeah, it does. And then Jesus said, don't even think that I've come to do away with the law and the prophets. I haven't come to do away with them, but to fulfill them. I say to you very seriously that as long as heaven and earth exist, neither the smallest letter or the smallest stroke of a pen will be erased from the law until everything there becomes a reality. So, are you ready? Here comes this week's Hebrew language lesson. Gray's going, oh, now I know why I got up early this morning, so I could come and learn Hebrew more. Did you take Hebrew back in the day? Okay, so you're my witness. If I get this wrong, you raise your hand, okay? Okay. Now, some of us are old enough to remember the King James Version of the Bible, okay? Now, I'm not saying that you've been around since 1611, okay? Stop smiling, Chris. You just are old enough to remember the English language, that old English language that was used in that version of the Bible, the King James Version. So maybe you remember this verse. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one small tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled. Okay? Remember that? Not one jot, not one tittle. And of course, we all remember what yods and tittles are, right? Yeah, Chris says, well, of course I do, okay? So the yod is the smallest letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, that's what a yod looks like, okay? Now, to put it in context, this is what it looks like in the Hebrew word Elohim. Okay? A tiny, tiny little letter. Not an apostrophe, that's an actual letter, the yod. Elohim means, shout it out, God. Okay? That's the Hebrew word for God. And that tiny little yod letter, that's the smallest letter. Now, the tittle, that's the small tail that makes a difference between a daled and a resh. Okay? And of course, the daleds and the reshes, remember that. Okay, so if you look at those two letters, the arrow is pointing to the daled, and that little tail that's up there, that's the tittle. So a daled, which is a D, looks like that. The resh, which is an R, doesn't have the tittle. So even the smallest letter, the smallest little tail on the end of a letter won't pass away. Nothing will change in the law until it is fulfilled. Not a yod, not a tittle. Jesus came to fulfill every detail of the law and the prophets. And you and I, we are called to live this out. Okay, again, Greg can't answer this time because I picked on him enough. Okay, how many commandments, statutes, and ordinances are there in the Old Testament? 600 and some. 613. Okay, if you add the one Jesus put on the Last Supper, that's 614, but we're going with 614. What? Oh, you haven't counted recently. Oh, Rick, I know what you're doing this week. 613. And on top of that, we have to listen to and heed the prophets, okay? Both the major and the minor prophets. Wow. How can you and I possibly remember this, much less not break a single law or instruction from the prophets? Chris, you can't answer because you've been with confirmation class, so you know the secret. But the rest of you, what's our little secret in keeping all of the law and the prophets? Remember? What did Jesus tell the Pharisee later in his ministry? Okay, in Matthew, about 15, 17 chapters later, we hear this. One of them, a Pharisee legal expert, tested Jesus. Teacher, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Oh, again, how many commandments are there? 613? So if you pick one, you don't pick 612. Okay? Is that a question that you can't win on? Doesn't matter what he picks, he's not going to pick another one, then he's going to get called out on that one. So what's the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your being, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You must love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. And when you and I, when we live this way in the world, especially in a world that is hurting and broken and in a need of healing and hope, when we are loving God with everything we've got and loving our neighbors as Jesus wants us to love our neighbors, guess what? We are letting our light shine. Remember our lesson from Isaiah this morning? Guess what? He continued on, okay? Later in the reading, Isaiah also says this. He says, then your light will break out like the dawn, and you will be healed quickly. Your own righteousness will walk before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. And what causes us to be? What causes our light to break out like the dawn? Have you ever been up early enough to see the morning star in the sky? Chris, is that a bright star? Especially in a really cold morning when you're sleeping outside with Boy Scouts. But it's a bright star. Oh, and is the morning star a star? No. It's a planet, right? It's reflecting the light of the sun. There's a lesson there, okay? And then if you're there to see the morning star, then you're for sure going to be up and see the dawn. And as it starts getting brighter and brighter. When I walked across the parking lot this morning, the sun was not coming through the windows, I'll assure you that. It was dark. I could just see this, the beginning of the rosy dawn. But if I'd go out to the parking lot now, would there be shadows? Yeah, so bright that there'll be shadows outside. So that dawn that just comes and transforms the world. Oh, anyway, back to Isaiah, okay? What causes our light to break out like the dawn? You see, in that passage today, Isaiah, he lists the ways that the leaders of Israel are wrongly fasting, okay? It's a tiring list. But then he ends the list with this transition. He says, "Is this what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Isn't this the fast that I choose? Releasing wicked restraints, untying the ropes of a yoke, setting free the mistreated and breaking every yoke. Isn't it sharing your bread with the hungry and bringing the homeless poor into your house, covering the naked when you see them and not hiding from your family? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and you will be healed quickly. Your own righteousness will walk before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and God will say, I'm here." Letting our light shine. And the way that we let our light shine in a dark and hurting and broken world, the way that we fulfill all of the law and the prophets, the way that we are more righteous than the religious leaders of that day, how is that? It's by loving God, taking time to know God more in the secret and the quiet place of our prayer and devotional time, wanting to know God, to hear God's voice, to see God's face. And not just our devotion, not just our time with God, not just our love of God, but then also by living out our love with our neighbors, with each person we meet. Now, sometimes in the church when we baptize someone, it's a tradition to light a baptismal candle. Okay? We don't do it here in Pine Island. Have you ever done baptismal candles, you guys? Yeah, I love doing that. We have a special candle we'd order from a special company, and then I'd light it, and then it was so great because you'd see the little baby and their eyes would just go to the candle, and their eyes would like light up, okay? Not just with the candle, but it's like they were really interested in that candle. And I'd hold that candle in front of that baby, and I would say these words: "Let your light shine, so that others, seeing your good works, may give glory to your Father in heaven." So from the baptism of little babies, we're given that charge to let our light shine. And how do we let our light shine? Well, by keeping all the commandments, by loving God, by loving our neighbors. Friends, let your light shine. Because as we sang earlier today, you are the flame that will lighten the dark, sending sparkles of hope, faith, and love. May your good deeds show a world in despair a path that will lead all to God. Let's leave with our blessing. Friends, we ask not for what we want, but for what you know we need. We offer this week and ourselves for you and to you through Jesus Christ our Savior. Go in peace. Serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.